Hello and welcome to a webinar. This one's on assets and identities. This is part 2 of Splunk's bite-sized security. Assets and identities, the bedrock of enterprise security. Just to set the scene about what we expect to go through, or what I'm planning to go through in this webinar. First off, we're going to look at why we have assets and identities. We're going to relate that to CIS controls. So this is a very good standard to align to. We're going to look into the asset identity framework. This is one of the 5 key frameworks in enterprise security, Splunk's SIEM offering. And we're going to ask the vital questions for successful implementation. So we really want to know, what do we need to know to actually make sure that we have a very robust and truthful set of assets and identities, at least as best as we can. And we're going to show how to configure that in Splunk Enterprise Security, how to get those sort of things set up and how to get the asset identity framework set up. And then we're going to go for a demonstration of that entire framework in detail in the product and under the hood. So hopefully you're going to stay around for that. So first off, let's look at the CIS controls. And CIS control number 1 is inventory and control of enterprise assets. That essentially means having a list of all of the assets that should be on the network, whether they're physical, virtual, in the cloud, wherever, what relevance that asset has to the business, how important it is to the business, what area of the business it is, and who owns that particular asset. So if something happens to it, you know who to contact and deal with. That's for assets. Obviously, it aligns straight away to the first CIS control. And then in terms of control number 5.1 is to establish and maintain an inventory of accounts. And this is really having a list of all your accounts with people's names, their usernames, all of the different usernames that they might be using across, Windows devices, across Mac, across Linux, across applications, all of those things that could be logging in with, and having details around them, how they should be kind of coming in. And that sort of list should be recurring and are dynamically updated as often as possible, really. So that's one of the reasons why we have it. Okay, now the asset identity framework is set up like this. Okay, we have it really set up for 2 main reasons. We have it for context in a sense that when a security analyst sees a particular username come in, they know who that user belongs to. They know the first name, last name, they know their telephone number, they know who their manager is, they know how important that account is to the business or that user is to the business, right? They know what area they're working in, they know their location. So if they start logging in from a certain location that seems a bit unexpected, they know that's odd behavior. All of that kind of information can be given to them because we are providing that at the fingertips in the identity framework. And the same for correlation. So correlation in the sense that if we have an event that comes in with an IP address and we have an event that comes in with a host name, how do we know they're the same asset? Well, the asset framework links that together because on their own we wouldn't know that, right? So we have an asset table there that kind of correlates those 2 events to being the same asset. So we know what's actually happening to each individual asset based on whatever field it is that actually is being reported on. So in terms of how this sets up, really, what we do with the asset identity framework is we first off either use external add-ons or we build searches that look in terms of into Active Directory or into your endpoint logs or into some cloud technologies that are kind of keeping information about what's going on with your assets or your identities, lots of different areas. And we may even have to combine these to get a good picture of everything that we really need to understand, right? AED could be useful for some part of asset information, but probably not all of it. We want to probably look in the CMDB, if there is one. We may want to look at our endpoint EDR solution, because that's going to give us a lot of information about the asset itself, because if it's got an EDR agent on it, that means it should be a trusted asset. So we could do that. We could be combining those things together. So when we build these searches, we then build lookups. Those lookups then go into another layer of normalization that happens in terms of what's going on under the hood. These are a number of safe searches that build canonical lookup tables, so trusted, authoritative lookup tables that can then be consumed by the analyst in enterprise security in many different dashboards, including in search, which we'll see shortly. And some of that can be configured. We can configure, obviously, the lookups themselves. We can also configure additional fields, and we'll go into that as we go through the demo. So what are the important questions then? So the first question is, how are we getting the data, right? What's the method of collection? Do we need to have SA LDAP search to be able to LDAP search that data? If we're in Splunk Cloud, How do we get that data from our on-prem domain controllers into Splunk Cloud? We need to really understand that. How often should we be polling that data, right? How often do we need it? We probably need it at least once a day, maybe more often. IP addresses might change very frequently for VPN systems, for example. So maybe we need to get data on a more regular basis so that we can populate, so we have the latest and greatest. How do we prioritize everything, right? Is it the group that is part of? Is it the title of that user? Is it the area? Maybe in the CMDB, we've already got that information. We know how important it is to the business beforehand. Maybe it's the IP address, the IP range. It could be a number of different things, and we have to explore all those different options and basically build that into our logic that creates that prioritization in our search. How do we categorize them? Categorizing and prioritizing probably the two most important pieces to all these assets, right? Categorizing things allows us to do prohibited traffic from one category of assets to another category of assets. We can filter everything down into a much smaller category. Maybe we want to know when things are privileged, right? We want to know all the privileged accounts. We want to categorize them so we can see if anything's gone on with our privileged accounts, right? And we can take a closer look at these kind of areas. We can write correlation searches to just look at privileged accounts. How do we identify the locations of resources, right? So if we want to do anything that's related to location-based searches or information, how do we know where these assets exist, right? It might be in the cloud, but which region is it in? It might be on-prem in your own data center. It might be these laptops live in certain areas. It might be desktops sit inside the office, right? Let's do as best as we can to kind of get a kind of a location sense to as much as we can. Is really useful. And it might be it's already in AD for users, so we can pull that out. So those are the 5 vital questions that I would say should be answered when we go through assets and identities. When you enable this in Splunk Enterprise Security, it actually should all exist in Splunk SA Identity Management, right? This is a supporting add-on to ES. It comes with an ES install, and this is really the ideal place to put your lookups and to put your searches, and really where you should do it. But it also has a number of different things inside there, right? So it contains searches to generate the lookups. They're built inside here. So if you want to go and explore this in a bit more detail, you have ES. Have a look what's in here. It contains both CSV and KB store lookups that do everything for as I say, the lookups. It also contains macros, right? And there's a couple of macros that are really useful to know about if you're here looking to try and get some information at the end of your correlation search. You've got some Tstats going on in a data model, and you want to kind of just grab something to present back, or maybe depending on the priority of it, depends on what the result is and whether you want to alert on it. So there's one for get identity for events, and I'll show you in a demo how these kind of work. There's also one called get asset. These are both macros, so you put them in backticks essentially. And there are other selected macros that you can get specific events or specific fields from the identity list or the asset list if you want as well. You can have a look inside SA Identity Management to kind of get a bit more info about that. They also contains the automatic lookups that do the field extractions at search time. And again, I'll show you where this is visible in your search, right? So how this can be really useful for you. So let's go ahead and actually have a look at the platform. So if I come into I'll start with SA Identity Management. So under all configurations, which you can find under settings, all configurations, you'll see all of the different things that exist within, all the knowledge objects that exist within SA Identity Management. Out of the box comes with over 100 different things, parts of this particular frameworks, right? So we've got the collections. These are KB store lookups essentially, which includes the assets by string, assets by CIDR, identities expanded. These are the key lookups that if you go and do an input lookup on any of those, you'll find all of your assets or all of your identities and how they actually, where they are, okay, when they've been normalized by the searches that go on. You can see the macros that are going on. So if I go down to get asset, which is down here somewhere, get asset, and you've also got get asset by, so you could get asset by certain things. So there's that macro. You can look into details what that is. Get identity for events, another one that I pointed out there. We've also got all the lookups and the safe searches that go on and do things in the background, and all the transforms that reference the lookups as well. And so there's quite a lot of good stuff in there. So if you really want to get under the hood, have a look inside this and kind of try and understand what every piece kind of fits together. And what that really means when you want to write a search, What I would do as a kind of an idea, this is a very basic search, I would say, but kind of the minimum of what you would want to be doing when you start implementing an asset list. But I wanted to give you kind of a flavor of how I would normally start out writing something. So first off, figuring out where we're getting the data from. So in this case, there's a CSV that's put into the system or dumped on the backend server or however it is. And that's got a number of different fields in that hopefully align quite nicely, but sometimes don't. We then start doing our priority definement based on a few different fields, right? So there's part of critical priority servers. Maybe there's a group that is already an AD that we can use to do that. It's part of its computer name's called critical virtual server. Seems unlikely, but it's possible, right? It's a member of certain areas. It's got a certain host name format. Maybe we'll try and extract out anything about the system type or the system the naming convention of each of your systems, which is what we'll do if we had just like go into it. We'll try and see if there's anything there that gives us an idea of how important the system is, right? Maybe it's location-based data, maybe it's actually application-based data, maybe there's a list of applications that we should deeming to be a high critical priority to the business. We then do a category definement, which is essentially a pipe delimited list of categories. So here, in a sense, we use system type. We say, okay, well, if it's a system type server, we'll categorize it as a server. If it's a desktop, we'll add it and it's an endpoint, right? And if it's a virtual server, then we'll categorize it as a virtual machine. So it's all that kind of thing that we can do. And obviously these would be much longer, but I've just kind of cut them down for brevity, really. One other thing that you might use is business unit. Now, and notoriously in AD, this is kind of a free-form text field, and you'll generally find that actually there's quite a lot of kind of spelling mistakes or different versions of particular business units in there. Well, what we want to do is kind of limit that down to a smaller subset. So if we want to use this business unit as part of our prohibited traffic concepts or anything else, we want to kind of bring that down. So anything that's information technology actually comes down as IT, anything that's legal is legal, and all that sort of thing. You can work through that basically to clean it up. Or of course you can go back to the AD data or the source data and kind of get that as well. And anything that we don't have an idea for, right, we might just have to set them as being particular values. So we can do that. Of course, everything should be evaluated as much as possible where it can, and then we'll look into a lookup that tells us our asset locations based on city and country. That gives us the latitude, longitude, right? So we've got a lookup that would add to this and kind of get us that. Also, in sort of the newer versions of the common information model, we have something called the SIM entity zone, and that will give us an idea of the different brands or different areas of the business, different subparts of the business that maybe have overlapping IP space or overlapping username space. You want to give it a SIM entity zone so that you can kind of do that. Or if you're a managed service and you're getting lots of different customers into the same environment, that could be an example for when you would do that. And then we table it and output it basically. So that's a very brief kind of concept of how I'd look at a search, and I would expand that considerably. But I've just, yeah, that's the sort of starting point, I would say. So the next thing to look at is how we actually then embed this, right? So we've got that search, we've written our search, we're running it on a regular occurrence, okay, maybe nightly, maybe more frequently. We're creating a lookup. That lookup we then need to put into our asset identity management pages, right? So here you can find this under configure, under data enrichment, and under asset identity management, and that will load this particular page. We've got asset lookups and we've got identity lookups, and they're in a ranked position, right? And the ranking is important because any values that are single values, they will take the value from the top record, right? So in the case of assets, those single values would be is expected and priority, right? And some others down here as well, right? So those are the single values which you can see in the asset fields page, anything that's not multi-value. So if you've got a priority of an IP address at the top level, that will be the priority it is. But if that IP address exists in a lower record, that one won't be relevant, right? So you need to just, that's the reason for the priority here. Okay, so as I say, the asset fields, you can see them. You can actually add new fields if you wish to. So you can add in additional fields. Maybe you want to do groups or something like that for users. Maybe you want to keep a record of these. But out of the box, you'll see all these details, and there's good docs on this as well in Splunk docs. Similar for identities, same sort of thing. So we've got different ones. And I'll just point out the demo and static identities. These come out of the box as well as administrative ones, but demo and the static ones. So demo is just the things that you can see as a kind of starting point. probably want to disable them straight off. Static ones, I really would avoid using static lookups if you can. Everything should be dynamic wherever possible. There are some use cases where static ones are good, maybe even for your network devices, network ranges, shall we say, as a fallback, right? So you could have a whole range for your DMZ. So anything that's in this IP range, you know it's in the DMZ, so you know it's kind of a higher priority asset, even if you don't know anything about it, anything further about it. For whatever reason, it's not in your CMDB or something like that. Maybe it's brand new, who knows? So you can have something like that in there, which is a static list. And then you've got this administrative identities, which is an out-of-the-box list of all your all the identities that Splunk have come with that look like administrative, like default sort of things. So not just administrative, but default too. So things like admin, administrator, anonymous, Cisco. There's lots of different users that are in there. So a lot of cases you might leave that left open and running, but in some cases you might want to make sure that you provide details on those default and admin privileged accounts that might be seen in your environment that are shared. Of course, you would want to make sure you got your service accounts in your normal list as well. So there's your lookups, you can add those in. And you've got identity fields similar to the asset fields across here as well. So these are the identity fields. You can see what's multi-value, what's not. You can also see what limits they have as well. There's particular high level of field values for those. A few things to point out in global settings. If you do SIM entity zones, you want to just check these sides on here, and you want to make sure you're merging things. So I've seen environments where it's not kind of working because the merging isn't turned on. Anything you want to ignore, you can also ignore down here as well. One other catch is to enable correlation between this for all your source types or for a selective source type. So this is the search. When I show you in a minute, that when you run a search, the source type will match this, and it will have automatic lookups that are running that will populate the user's priority, the desk priority, and stuff like that. And if you want to see anything about how it's all being merged together, you can see that in the search preview as well. So you can see all those lookups being built together and how they kind of then actually get merged together. So if there's anything that's going wrong, that can be a place to kind of look, kind of run these searches, see why it's not merging together as it should be. One thing that you can also do is just add in particular things either from cloud services or from LDAP. So you could add in them directly for a wizard here if you wanted to, or you can do it with professional services or on your own, basically in the background, kind of building that search and kind of coming together and adding it in this way. But you can also just have a new configuration which just looks for a particular lookup that's already in the system and use that. So that's the kind of asset identity management piece. If I look at the fields for the identities here for this particular one, right? So we can see the business unit, we can see the category, we can see the email address, we've got first names, identities. So this is a pipe delimited list of all the identities that user might be using. We've got the last name, phone numbers, we've got the priorities, all sorts of different things, work details, location details. So this is what you would expect to see, and then you can come in and have a look at those lookups at any point as well. So this was the identity lookup. So how's this actually used, right? So, well, if you're running a search, let's say a Tstat search, right? So this is looking for changes, and if I run it straight out of the box, I've got a user, I've got a destination, it's making processes, right? Creating processes. Okay, so that's fine. That ran pretty quickly. But actually, I want to know a bit more about that user, right? So what I can do is I can use this macro get identity for user. I can delete those get identity for events. Oh, I've got rid of too many. Get another backtick. There you go. So I get identities for events for that user. So it's going to take that user field, and now what you're going to see is the user's email address, the user's category, the user's business unit. So we've got a lot more fields coming out here now, right? All the different identities that user could be, maybe their last name, who they're managed by, ghoppy, you know, all this kind of interesting detail that we now have that we could use, right? So including the user's priority, which will be down here, right? So they're a critical user in this case. So we could then append to this search, okay, well, if they're a critical user, maybe let's increase the risk, maybe let's increase the severity of the alert, all sorts of different things that we could do there for that particular thing. And very similar, we can do that, of course, for destinations, right? Or for assets, right? So if we want to have a look at the asset details, I'll just get rid of that one now for now and just see the desks. So here we've got the information about the destination, right? So this is Theodore's laptop. It's a workstation, it's Windows, it requires AV, it should be updating. If I scroll to the right, we've got lots of more details around it. Who's it owned by? Theodore, right? What's its IP address? So previously we just had literally an IP address, or no, we didn't. We had a full destination. But now we have all this information about this particular thing. We've got the IP, we've got should it update, all sorts of different things, and of course we've got desk priority in here as well. Which is low, right? Because it's a laptop and so forth. So we've got all of that great detail in here by just using these macros, and you can see how quickly that is and how useful that is. So that's if you want to use something that isn't populated in the results, you can just call it in your search. In addition, if you run a search that doesn't have anything, but it's running on your ES search head, because we've got it enabled for all source types. In this case, I'm looking at a particular destination, right? I've just grabbed the first 100 events, and it's just automatically extracted fields for me about this destination, right? So I know it's city, San Francisco. I know it's DNS, Theodore's laptop. I know it's host. I know it's owner. I know where it is. I know it's priority, right? All of that is just there for me now, because there's automatic lookups out of the SA identity management piece that kind of pulls that together, so I can get the details in my interesting fields on an ES box there. Now, if you want to delve a little bit more in detail of it, there are under security domains, identity, asset center, and identity center. So in the identity center, you can just search within the identity center for all the different identities. You've got a kind of a viewpoint on what's going on in terms of the categorizing them, in terms of the business unit. So when you're building it, you can kind of see how that's kind of all gone together. There's also a watch list kind of piece as well. So if you want to put anybody on a watch list, you can do that as well. So that's your identities. Similar for assets, you can do in the asset center a very similar kind of piece. So if you want to go into detail on that, it shows you all the different assets that are in their business unit, all sorts. And if you want to filter by particular things, right, you can filter by PCI assets, you can filter by contractor assets, you can filter by Splunk assets if you really wanted to, or privileged assets. Or anything else, any other category that you wanted to do, same for Identity Center. So you can kind of browse what's going on with your assets and identities in that sense. And if I come into incident review page here, and I look at a particular event, another place that you can see this, as well as in the actual notable details down here, if the system is actually in the asset list, which I'm not sure this one is, but let's have a look. So when you expand a risk notable, which we'll talk about risk in the version episode 3 of this, so you can see this actually isn't in our assets and identity framework, but if it was, we'd get a lot more details around it about kind of at the fingertips, the context, right? So this particular host isn't in the asset identity framework, but there are some that are. So here we can get ideas of this particular user here, and we can see all this kind of user categories that we can see is privileged account, all the different identities that they would be used as well. So we can see that in both the notable event, but also in risk events as well, as across the top there as well. And if we wanted to actually expand on this particular user and go into our identity investigator, which is the kind of piece with the swim lane side of things, it'll populate the identity and give you all that information around that identity there as well. So all the different user accounts that they have, as well as everything else, where they work, who they're managed by, all those details are all populated there as well. Okay, with that, thank you very much for joining me. Been a pleasure. Join me in the next one, which we'll be talking about risk-based alerting in episode 3 of this Splunk Bite Size series on security.